Steve, let's put on hold for just a few minutes the analysis of the current situation here in 2019, because I am a very chronological thinker. So we're going to go back to the beginning, the origin, at least for you and for myself, and what we remember about this game. And let's start with the early memories for you and what gave you that sense of it being a special, unique rivalry.
Well, we moved to Michigan when I was 10 years old in 1983. It was actually late in the fall of 1983. And I think like the very first weekend I can remember, I was in the 5th grade, flipping channels. I remember watching Doug Flutie throw the Hail Mary pass. No, that was actually a year later, 84. So, you know, I was a huge baseball fan. I had just gotten into football. The Detroit Lions were in first place in the old NFC Central with Billy Sims. And so I jumped on that bandwagon like you would as a 10-year-old, thinking, wow, I just moved here. This team's really good.
I think that was a 9-7 division champion,
yes,
I believe.
Yeah, it was. I'm like, this is going to be an easy tandem. Little did I know what the next 36 years of my life this team was going to do to me. I'm flipping channels and I'm watching a guy named Steve Smith hand off to a guy named Rick Rogers. And I'm watching Michigan beat Ohio State with Mike Tomczak and Keith Byers that day. And I loved I was loosely familiar with them because my stepdad grew up in Michigan. So when I was really young, when Michigan was in the Rose Bowl with like a Rick Leach and then later an Anthony Carter, we would watch. But I really wasn't familiar with them. But the maize and blue and the winged helmet, the very first Michigan game I ever watched live with interest all the way through was that 1983 Michigan-Ohio State game. And several years ago, that game was actually on local cable because of TV contracts back then. And so I actually have that. I had to go out and get it from an Ohio State fan online several years ago. I have a DVD copy of that game. And then that Michigan team went on to play Bo Jackson and Auburn in the Sugar Bowl as huge underdogs, and darn near pulled that upset in that game. And I've been hooked ever since. Some of the more memorable games I can remember. I can remember the 1986 game. I was in the 8th grade. I can remember that game, like I remember the lines of dialogue to Star Wars movies or, lyrics to, Led Zeppelin and Who and Beatles songs and U2 songs that I love. I mean, I remember the intro to that game. Even for now, 33 years later, the graphics package that CBS had for that game would stand up today. And they had the long form Rocky theme, for both Michigan and Ohio State. It was the Jim Harbaugh guaranteed victory game, and Michigan falls down 14-3 and nobody can stop Chris Carter, and it looks like it's lost. And then out of nowhere, a little 5'6" Jamie Morris just starts running around and through, end up trucking my all-time favorite Detroit Lion is Chris Spielman. I forget, trucking him on his way into the end zone. And then Michigan or Ohio State missed that kick at the end. Matt Franz, I want to say was the guy's name. And Eric Parsegan and Brett Musburger on the call. And I mean, it was that atmosphere, that presentation for 1986. I mean, we weren't used to seeing non-Super Bowl sporting events presented like that on television with that amount of pomp and circumstance. And so it's pretty regular today, but I remember that game, even though I was in the 8th grade, I remember that game like it was yesterday. I remember being home with my buddies for Thanksgiving break, and we were spending the weekend over at Rick O'Connor's house playing a Super Tecmo Bowl tournament. We took time out long enough to watch Michigan, Ohio State. This was 1991. That was Desmond Strike the Pose. I'll never forget that. Little trivia question. Kirk Herbstreit's the starting quarterback in that game for Ohio State. I believe he gets knocked out of that game, actually. I think he got what we call today a concussion. They called it getting your bell rung back then.
He did.
1993, Mercury Hayes, the over-the-shoulder catch in the shutout. And I remember that game because I was a student in college, and I won a crap ton of money from my bookie on campus on that game because Michigan was favored over a number 5 and undefeated Ohio State. They were 9-0-1, and Michigan was 6-4. And I said, that's the kind of spread they're just begging you to take Ohio State. And I was right. I put a whole bunch of money on that, and he hated me after that. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And that's why it's sad for me that it hasn't really been a rivalry for several years. And I tell people this, it's not a rivalry. It's a tradition. It is a grand tradition. It is one of the best traditions that we have in this sport, but it's not competitive. Navy and Notre Dame is a more competitive series. I mean, kids that are going to sign in here in a couple of weeks for early signing day have seen Purdue beat Ohio State more often in their lifetimes than Michigan. So it's not a rivalry. And I think what Michigan's job is to do on Saturday, Mark, is to make it so again, to be worthy again, to be counted worthy again as a program of that legacy and of that tradition, because it just has not been. And I don't count 2011. You know that. I mean, I'll take a win, but I don't go watch replays of that game. It's not in my DVD collection. It doesn't count. I mean, you're playing an Ohio State team that, with an interim coach and all the off the field issues going into the season, a lot of those same players came back next year and went 11-0. It doesn't, that game doesn't count. So really, it's not been since the 100th anniversary of the rivalry in 2003. I think that's the last time Keith Jackson called a Michigan and Ohio State game. So it really hasn't been since then that Michigan has won the game. So I think the job for Michigan on Saturday is to be counted worthy of making this a rivalry again. That's what I think this is about from a program standpoint on Saturday.
Like you, Steve, of course, I could go through the memories and we could be here for hours. I'll pick and choose, because 1983, what I remember about that game, and you alluded to this, is that I don't remember the game. So my first Michigan-Ohio State game was in 1977, so I've got a few years on you. But like you, I don't remember hardly anything about that Ohio State season. And full disclosure here, folks, Ohio State fan, people try to guess what team I root for, and I find it amusing when Ohio State fans rip me for being too hard on their team, because I take the neutral angle as best I can. That we all know is impossible, but I do the very best I can. So that 77 game was one of 3 consecutive games in which Ohio State could not score a touchdown against Michigan at the end of Woody Hayes.
The end of the 10-year war.
Final 3 runs, yeah. Final 3 games versus Michigan, but it was the first.
See, I can go back. I wasn't around for those. I mean, I was alive, but not interested. But I've studied so much of the history of this rivalry. I could tell you all about those games. And 1976, 22-0, for example. And you mentioned at the end of the rivalry there, at the end of the 10-year war, Ohio State did not score an offensive touchdown on Michigan in any of those 3 games. The 1973 game, that's the year I was born, where I think were number 1 versus number 4, and it was a tie game at the end, and you had the secret vote. And Bo Schembechler, even when he retired, they did this retirement video to commemorate his 21 years as coach of Michigan. And when they bring up that 1973 vote, the amount, this video was done in 1990, the amount of bitterness he has about it 17 years later, it's like it just happened 10 minutes ago. And he said that essentially fueled him for the rest of his career, the anger and resentment he had. I mean, for people that don't know that era, back then you couldn't go to a bowl game unless it was the Rose Bowl, and you couldn't go to the Rose Bowl twice in a row. So Michigan had 3 teams from 1972 to 1974 that went 32-1, shared the Big Ten championship every single year, and never played in a bowl game.
And I will edit right there. Okay. And for those people out there that are ingrained in Big Ten football, like Steve and I, please look up that documentary on that vote that was made in regards to who would go to the Rose Bowl that particular year, and the reunion of Ohio State and Michigan players around lunch discussing the various aspects of that season and that game. It's fascinating. It's funny you bring up the 76 22-0 game, because you brought a memory to mind. So even though the 77 game was the first one that I watched, it was a 14-3 Michigan win. The 22-0 game, I didn't remember anything about football, watching football. I don't even know how much of that game I actually watched, but I still have a memory of seeing Bo Schembechler being carried off on the shoulder of his players at the Horseshoe, and just even having that guttural response to know that I would shake my fist at the screen like, and I hadn't become a true football fan yet at that point, but it was so ingrained in me at that point as an Ohioan, as a Buckeye, that look at it, that just can't happen.
I've got a lot of those games, the actual broadcasts. I have a lot of those games on DVD in my collection. I have the 69 game, including the commercials, shelf over my shoulder. So I have a lot of those memories. I don't record. Well, it's not just Michigan, Ohio State. I don't record and keep games in recent years as much as I used to, because they're all just on YouTube and you can go watch them anytime you want now. And so they're not as rare as now. The current games aren't as rare as the old school ones were. But yeah, I have a lot of those memories on the shelves and the cases behind me, and a lot of on DVD. A lot of tremendous memories from this series in particular.
Yeah, we're cut from the same cloth in that manner, Steve. I've got the boxes down in the garage and in the basement with the VHS tapes. I just used to, I had to, Oklahoma, Miami. So I got to tape that game. I got to save it. I got to say, but the 83 game, so I just assumed that the game would be on TV. It was two top 10 teams. Illinois, of all teams, had wrapped up the Big Ten championship and was headed to the Rose Bowl, but Ohio State and Michigan were still both top 10 teams that eventually headed, as you said, to the Sugar Bowl, and for Ohio State, a Fiesta Bowl appearance against Pitt that year. And I didn't determine and didn't find out until I believe Friday that the game would not be on television. Imagine this, people. There was an Ohio State Michigan game that I did not see in my lifetime, the 83 game between two top 10 teams. It was not on television in Akron, Ohio. It was insane. That was
83, I believe, was the last season before you had the landmark Supreme Court case with the CFA, which broke the television networks and NCAA's monopoly on, you can only be on TV a certain amount of times, for example, a season. Like I remember even in the first few years after that landmark agreement, and then everybody else formed the CFA, and the Big Ten and Pac-10 went on and formed their own arrangement with CBS. And I want to say that started in 1984. I want to think was the first season where all the limits of how often you can be on TV. And that's why if you ever watch those old games from the 70s, you got Keith Jackson saying, hey, after Michigan, Ohio State, we're going to go live to Tulane and UAB. You're like, why? Well, because they had everybody on. It was essentially communism. I don't know how else to describe it, but that's not the meritocracy we have today. But I remember in '88 when Michigan and Illinois played for the Big Ten championship that year. And even still, when then it became ESPN Plus, but the old Raycom and regional networks and stuff like that. Michigan and Illinois played for the Big Ten championship in 1988 in a game that was not on television. And I want to say that was the last Michigan game not on TV. And it just so happened that Michigan, Illinois, the winner of that game, won the Big Ten that year, and it was not on TV. So people have no idea. Like when March Madness comes around and every game is on. I mean, I remember my parents calling if I didn't have a basketball game that was in the way and my grades were good, my mom always called me in sick the first 2 days of the NCAA tournament, because all the games were on ESPN, but they were on all day and all night because you can only watch so many games at once. And so we used to just literally just stay up all night long, watching, the Southeast Regional, replay at 2 a.m. Young kids today, Mark, have no idea how good. Right now they're watching channel 205 on DirecTV with 6 screens, like they're Phil Steele or something, in their home, or they got their iPad on and everything else. They have no idea what it was like back in the day.
My mom's correlation of an act of kindness in not having any idea or real appreciation for what I wanted to see. But, my attendance at school was perfect. So I believe it was the 1982 NFL draft on a Tuesday afternoon. She let me stay home to watch the NFL draft.
Nice.
So yeah, we could go on and on. Chris Spielman with 29 tackles in that 86 game against Michigan, but unfortunately for the Buckeyes, most of those were about 10 yards downfield as he was chasing, as you mentioned, Jamie Morris in a great game. The Buckeyes had the passing game going, but couldn't deal with Michigan's physicality. I'll bring up two quick memories before we catch everyone up to 2019, and I have it's kind of a morbid sports approach of fandom that I almost attach myself and hold on and grasp my teams even more fervently when they're down than I do when they're playing for championship seasons. When everybody else around me is, hey, we're 11-0 and we're on the bandwagon and ready to go. Sure, of course, the games are important, but that 4-6-1 Ohio State team in 1988, that Michigan game was like life.
I remember that game very well. Yeah.
And Ohio State came back from 20-0 down to make it a game, take a lead, and John Colasar got loose in the back of the end zone and caught a long heave from
after he ran that kickoff back to midfield before that, by the way, remember he had the long kickoff return, and then on the 2 plays later, then he was the whole 100 yards for Michigan.
Yeah, that's right. And that was a gut-wrenching end of my life loss for a 4-6-1 football team.
I remember
that's how important that was. 2 years later, Ohio State, trying to get back into a relevant nature, was playing for a Big Ten championship at the Shoe against Michigan. 13-13 tie, John Cooper's third season, and going for it on 4th and 1 with an NFL backfield of Raymond Harris, Robert Smith, and others. I could go down the list. Go for an option play with Greg Fry and set up a game-winning field goal for Michigan to win the Big Ten title or tie for it. And go to the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, if I remember right, the way
Iowa went to the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, because he thought he had to win the Big Ten title. And Iowa that night lost to Minnesota in the Metrodome.
Yeah.
And it turned out that if Cooper had just played for the 13-13 tie, they'd have gone to the Rose Bowl, I think is how it turned out that season.
Yeah.
And since he went for the win and then didn't get it, then Michigan got the win. And then Iowa lost that night to Minnesota. They're going to be a 4-way tie for first place. Illinois, Michigan State, Michigan, and Iowa all tied for the Big Ten title. And because of the tiebreakers, Iowa had beaten all those teams. They got to go to the Rose Bowl. Whereas if Cooper had just played, if my memory serves,
you're correct.
Ohio State hit
tied Indiana that year, so they were the only one not grouped in the tie with everybody else.
If he had played for the tie, of course he didn't know that. You didn't know that, And Iowa was a massive favorite in that game against Minnesota. They had an amazing season that year. And so to his defense, John did not know that. But the way it turned out, if he had actually been more John Coopery and just played conservatively and just played for the tie, that Ohio State would have gone to the Pasadena that year. So interesting. Yeah,
that's right. They instead went to play Air Force as a 17-point favorite in the Liberty Bowl and lost.
I remember that.
And mailed it in like 28-degree weather.
Yep.
All right, Steve, we're here in 2019, but before we even get to just solely 2019, if you can take a step back, and it's impossible to do, at least for me, completely, but I try to do it each and every day as I cover college football. Why would this be the greatest rivalry in college football? And this is my approach to it, is that I take Army and Navy and put them in a completely separate category, and then I rank everyone else. And I still believe it to be the greatest rivalry in college football, even taking my bias out of it as best I can.
I think the reason why, Mark, is, and I think your approach with Army Navy is correct. That's on a level of Americana that transcends sport. I think it degrades it to call it a rivalry, in my view. So I think you do have to separate that from just a mere sporting contest. What you have with Michigan and Ohio State is you have, first of all, these are the only two states in American history that ever declared war on one another. Now, it didn't last very long. I believe it lasted like 10 minutes, okay? And that's where, if people that wonder why is Toledo kind of like 50-50 Michigan and Ohio territory, well, the compromise to stop these two states from going bleeding Kansas on one another. The compromise was Ohio got Toledo and the UP was taken away from Wisconsin and given to the state of Michigan. So right away, you've got kind of an ingrained anger and resentment there between the two. It was a very good rivalry prior to the 10-year war. But if you're a Michigan fan, you had phenomenal rivalries with Minnesota. In fact, you probably would have considered Minnesota your primary rivalry in the first 50, 60, 70 years of college football, whether it's the Little Brown Jug era with Fielding Yost, the Bronco Nagurski era, the Benny Bierman era, the Tom Harmon era. The current winning streak Ohio State has over Michigan, only one team has ever enjoyed anything close to this. In this era I'm talking about, Minnesota had won 13 in a row against Michigan. And it was Tom Harmon, the great Heisman Trophy winner, old 98 for Michigan, who broke that streak of futility in 1940 with Fritz Chrysler. So, I think until that point, until the 10-year, until Woody Hayes, Ohio State probably considered Michigan more of a rival than Michigan did. And a lot of that is Michigan's ingrained arrogance as part of being Michigan. Okay. And then, we have Woody Hayes come and change things quite a bit. Michigan really coasted on its success that it had in the 40s and post-World War II, and probably left guys like Bump Elliott as head coach and Benny Oosterbaan as head coach for too long. You have this young, take no prisoners, Miami of Ohio guy goes to Ohio State and just radically transforms the landscape. Of course, I'm talking about Wayne Woodrow Hayes. And where I think this thing went to a different level and became what we know today. And I think what made it the greatest rivalry, Mark, is it was perfectly timed for the explosion of the television era, where this became a television spectacle. And you still had, these were still the huge population centers in the late 60s to 70s to mid 80s in the Rust Belt, states like Michigan and Ohio. And so that the timing, the convergence there of Woody Hayes, an all-time national power, Michigan, the winningest team, but Woody Hayes is kind of the Microsoft of this story, and Michigan is the IBM. They're kind of coasting off of, we're the granddaddy here, and you have Woody Hayes just running like, I don't care, we're just here to win, screw you, we're Bill Gates kind of a program. And Michigan didn't understand how to compete with this, nor did it really think it wanted to, and kind of thought it was better than that, which is all a lie. But when institutions are racked with arrogance, they tell themselves lies like this, and really they're just excuses for why you're willing to embrace the suck. I think this thing really took off was in 1968, and Bump Elliott, who went on to have a great career as the athletic director at the University of Iowa, hired Hayden Fry, resurrected that program from one of the worst in the nation to one that has been a fairly consistent winner for the last 30 some odd years. He was Mr. Nice Guy, and everybody loved Bump. And he was just going to ride off into the sunset and enjoy his retirement. And Michigan and Ohio State met the final game of the regular season, both teams ranked in the top 10. Michigan has a wonderful player, Heisman Trophy candidate, who would go on to win the Silver Football Award that year, Ron Johnson. He had just set the NCAA single-game rushing record a couple of years before. A couple of guys on their offensive line, Reggie McKenzie, Dan Dierdorf, these guys would go on to become NFL Pro Bowl Hall of Famers. Michigan has a really good team. But you have this Ohio State team with these super sophomores that had taken the 1968 season kind of by storm. And they meet in Columbus, and this is supposed to be Michigan's year to turn the tide in the rivalry. This is going to sound, it's eerie how similar it sounds to this year, actually, the 50th anniversary of this. And this was the year that Michigan was going to turn the tide in the rivalry. Michigan goes down to Columbus very confident and just gets absolutely annihilated in this game. And at the end of the game, the backups are in, and they scored to make it 50-14. And Woody, there's urban legends about why this happened. Some of it is, the one side of the story is that he put the starters back in because there was confusion with so many backups about whether to kick the extra point or not. And so he just hurriedly put the starters in to make it happen, okay, to avoid a penalty. There's another story that, hey, the players are on the sideline chanting, go for two. And Woody said, yeah, let's do it. So he puts the starters back in to go for two, up 50-14. And after the game, Joe Falls, a legendary columnist for the Detroit News, asks Woody Hayes, why did you do this? And why are you running the score up on Bump Elliott? Everybody loves Bump Elliott. And Woody glared at him, and he said, I went for two, quote, because I couldn't go for three. And, Michigan realized now had a new hotshot AD named Don Canham, who was into modern marketing and things of that nature. He's going to put AstroTurf in at Michigan Stadium the next year and bring this program back, into the latter part of the 20th century. But he needed a big name coach. He knew that. He tried like crazy to hire Joe Paterno, get him to leave Penn State. Because Paterno couldn't get any respect from the pollsters. He would finish undefeated and have, and he was in the next year, actually, he would finish undefeated and would not even be a factor for the national championship. So we thought, Canham thought, I can get him to come to the Big Ten, coach Michigan, and Paterno wouldn't leave. But he recommended a young man, 39-year-old coach at Miami of Ohio named Glenn Bo Schembechler, who Canham eventually found out was essentially a surrogate son to Woody Hayes. He had been his prized assistant, pupil, offensive coordinator at Ohio State. He was essentially being groomed to someday replace Woody. And he realized Woody wasn't retiring anytime soon, so he left to go coach at Miami of Ohio, where Woody had come from and where Woody was his coach when he played there. Bo was an alum of Miami. So many great coaches have come from there. And he coached there for 6 years, and when he realized I wasn't getting the call at Ohio State anytime soon, he could not say no to Michigan. And when he came to Michigan, he established this program. The identity, everything was Ohio State. The same offense, defense, everything. Terminology, everything. And it was all geared about beating Ohio State. And when the game finally came along, that Michigan team that year had 2 losses. Ohio State was considered the best team in the country at the time, that maybe only the Purple People Eaters or the Minnesota Vikings could beat them. No, they were considered the team of the century or one of them. They had just, soundly beaten O.J. Simpson and USC in the Rose Bowl the year before, and they were just mollywopping everybody every single week. And ABC, just like game day is not coming to the game this year, they're going up to Minneapolis. ABC sent the B crew. Thought no chance. There's no stories going to happen here to Ann Arbor. So, no point sending, the A team to call the game. And it was considered an afterthought. But during that week, those Michigan players, it was most of the same players for both teams that were in the blowout the year before in Columbus were back. Ohio State had brought back all those super softs. Michigan had a lot of young talent, McKenzie, Deerdorf, all those guys were back. And Bo had put the number 50 on every player on the practice squad all week long. Everywhere they went, they saw the number 50 as a reminder. And, Michigan went out there and pulled what they called at the time the upset of the decade, 24-12 over Ohio State, and years later at his commemorative before he passed away, Woody Hayes spoke at the dais and at his party, and Bo was sitting there in the front row. This was in 86 or 87. And Woody said, and Woody was very feeble at the end. I don't know how many Ohio State fans know this, but Woody would often come to Michigan practices at the end of his life. Him and Bo during the 10-year war were estranged. They didn't talk at all. I mean, they would talk once a year, and they would go out there. How's your wife? Fine. How's mine? Great. That was it. And they were father and son before and after this. And then after, what happened with Woody's firing and Bo helped, Woody kind of rehabilitate his image after that. And they got to be good friends again. Now, don't get me wrong. He was still, when we played Ohio State, giving the hype speech in the locker room. All right. But he would come to Michigan practices, and him and Bo were very, very close. And so Bo's got, a front row seat here at Woody's going away party, retirement party. And Woody says, they asked me what my best team was. And he starts talking about that 69 team, and he lowers his glasses and he glares at Bo and he says, "Damn you, Bo, you'll never win a bigger game than that one." And that's the game that reestablished Michigan football. The program of Bo Schembechler that then Gary Moeller picked up and Lloyd Carr picked up. We went for decades, Mark, were the only two major powers in college football that never had a downturn. They might have like a 6-5 season, but never a 2 or 3 year down cycle, were Michigan and Ohio State. And it pretty much went this way until Michigan hired Rich Rod. And now Ohio State's the only program left that has not had the down cycle. And so when you throw in the consistency of those two programs, the stature of those programs, the historicity of those programs, the fact that they came from what were at the time the major population Rust Belt, they were on noon. You saw the same, like almost like an event, a Thanksgiving Day NFL game. that weekend, everybody around the country grew up watching that. I think that's what made it the rivalry that we used to know it as, and it hasn't been that, for several years because Michigan hasn't held up its end of the bargain.
I was having a ludicrous debate the other day with a Florida State writer who was selling Florida State Miami as a bigger rivalry than Ohio State and Michigan. And I told him to go in the middle of May or June and open up a schedule for the next college football season on any major website. And I told him you will find 2 games that will already be scheduled, game time and network. And that's Army-Navy and Ohio State and Michigan on the previous ABC contract and the current Fox contract, because they prize that game regardless if they both show up 2-9, whatever the records are. That will be their, that was their first selection, Fox, and then previously ABC before the season. We want that game. That's our first selection. Boom, there it is. And even when they show up with marginal teams or one of them is down, it still is typically the highest rated game of the regular season. That's another thing I had to look up, and I didn't need to look it up, but to get the exact numbers for him, because this particular person was bragging that in 2006, Florida State and Miami set an ESPN ratings record with a 6.9 rating. And I said, well, let's clarify 2 things. You're talking to the wrong guy here when you talk television ratings and talk about somebody who actually has the ratings for the overnights emailed to me every day at work. Number one, let's clarify that was at the time, that was 13 years ago, and that's been eclipsed, number one. Number two, let's also understand that about within a 0.1 of the rating will be able to say this without looking it up, but I will look it up just to verify. So your 2006 Florida State Miami game got a 6.9 rating, and the 2006 Ohio State Michigan game got a 13 rating. So
number 1 versus number 2
was eclipsed and doubled. And I went through the years, and I have claimed many times that we can go to the records and the championships and the number of NFL players that are produced, and over the consistency of time, I think that bears out. But certainly there are pockets in which Alabama, Auburn, Florida State, Miami, and other rivalries eclipse it on the field in those measurements. But if you're
USC, Notre Dame, sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. But if you're going to go history, you're going to combine the metrics of the rear ends in the seats at the stadium and the eyeballs on television. Nothing comes close. And then just the anecdotal evidence that I have throughout my life. I've been around, gone to different college football venues, and anytime rivalries are brought up by anybody, they speak of their regional or state rivalry, and then the next one out of their mouth, if they expand it, is Ohio State and Michigan.
Early in my sports media career, I got to know Earl Bruce really well, which was surreal for me growing up as a Michigan fan. And I remember when his unceremonious firing, and when Ohio State was preseason number 5, and Spielman and Chris Carter were brought back, and Chris Carter got busted with the agent issue, and that kind of was a star-crossed season. That 4th and 38 or whatever it was, Iowa converted that year, that basically got Earl Bruce fired, and Bo was incensed at what they did at Ohio State to Earl, and he was about to become the AD at Michigan, and even said publicly, "Hell, maybe I'll hire him to be my football coach. I'll retire because I'm going to be the AD and he can coach here." Because Earl actually had a winning record against Bo. They were tied going into 1987, and then he won that game. The week that he was fired, and so early in my sports media career, when we had an arena football team here in Des Moines, Earl came to coach it, and I was not a fan of some of the. I was a big arena football kid growing up, watching Art Schlichter for the Detroit Drive in Michigan. But I wasn't a fan of what the owner of the Iowa Barnstormers was doing at the time, and I was really, really hard on him on my radio program, and he thought a good way to maybe endear himself to me was to introduce me to his new football coach, Earl Bruce. Thought I might really enjoy getting to know the inside of this rivalry, and I used to travel with the team. Earl told me so many great stories, most of which I probably could not repeat here. But Before we talk about over the last couple of years, you and I have done this. I've been waiting for the right time to share the best Woody Hayes story he told me. I think this is a good time. All right. And I'm going to clean this up the best that I can. Okay. I'm going to do my best to make this. How about, is PG-13? Is that okay? Can we make it PG-13?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Earl was adamant that Woody was adamant about not owing anybody anything. And when Woody passed away, his wife found honorarium checks for Booster Club events and other speaking engagements that he never cashed, because he did not want to have anybody have a claim on him, anybody try to pressure him, influence him, or anything. And so when Earl was a young assistant for Woody, they were going to go on a recruiting trip, and I want to say it was to Cincinnati. It was Cincinnati or Cleveland, one of those big cities, okay? And Earl's job was to set up the trip, make all the arrangements, and drive the old man to the home and then drive him back to Columbus. And it's the dead of January when they're taking this home visit. And Woody was famous for wearing those short sleeve shirts during the season, no matter how cold it got. He comes out for this visit and he's wearing one of those with like a light parka. They get in the car. The window is cracked so Woody can breathe some fresh air. It's freezing in the car the whole drive. Earl cannot listen to the radio because Woody's reading one of his war history books, Patton or something like that probably, and he wants silence. The whole drive there, Woody never talks to him about doesn't care about it, doesn't ask him about his family, nothing. All right, it's just total silence, And they get to the recruit's house, and what do you think happens? Turns on the charm, man. He's like a whole different person. And they got to get out of there. Otherwise, they're not going to get back to Columbus before nightfall. And nope, he keeps staying and he's trying to close the deal with this family and this kid. And finally they get done and it's way too late to make the drive back to Columbus. And Woody's like, well, where are we going to stay? And Earl says, well, Coach, I called ahead just in case this happened. And I called there's the nicest airport in town is owned by an Ohio State grad. And we've each got our own room, colored TV, everything, nothing to worry about. We're good to go. And they're standing out in the driveway in the dead of January in the freezing cold. Earl and Woody looks at him and says, F that, we're not doing that. F that. And Earl's like, Coach, it doesn't come out of the recruiting budget. Guy's going to donate it. He's happy to do it. He's a big booster. He loves what we're doing. And Woody says, F that. No, that's never happening. Go back in that house, call the airport, and tell him to get my room ready. And Earl's like, the airport? Yeah, they'll know what to do. Just go in there, call the effing airport, tell them to get my room ready, and then we'll just drive over to the airport. We'll just crash there. So Earl goes back into the recruit's house, calls the airport, thinking the old man's lost his mind. Sure enough, they have a room. They keep on standby at this airport for Coach Hayes. They drive over to the airport. They show him back to their room. And it's like when they used to have the old-fashioned red eyes, for pilots. It's a cabin quarters. It's a makeshift cabin quarters. A couple cots, and a shower and a toilet with a TV. That's what it is for pilots to crash when they're doing red eyes and overnights, with FAA guidelines and stuff. Right? So this is his room, and they get and Earl's got to go to the bathroom so bad, man. He's been the whole time. Woody goes right in there before he does everything. Finally, he comes out, and he's ready for bed. And Earl's like goes in there. He's got to go to the bathroom, shower, shave. And he comes out. All the lights are on in this room, and Woody is reading again this book, sitting up in the bed reading the book with all the lights on. And Earl comes out and he's like, I can't fall asleep. I got to wind down. He tries to turn the TV on, and Woody says, no. So he goes back to bed, waits for the old man to fall asleep. Finally, he starts slinking into the covers and looks, and he waits and waits, and it looks like he's out. And Earl says he gets up and he goes to turn the TV on. Because that's back before, everybody had a remote control, kids. Okay. And all of a sudden, as he's just about to turn on the TV, Woody sits straight up in his bed and he screams out, F them all. F them all. And Earl's like, what in the world? This guy's disciplined, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. I know he's not on drugs. What? This is the most disciplined man I've ever met in my life. This behavior is so erratic. I don't get it. You know, so he's unnerved by this, as anyone would be. So he can barely sleep all night long. The next morning, they get up, they go down, they get cleaned up, they go out to the, you know, it's an airport in a major city. You know, in the morning it's busy. They go to the diner inside the airport. It's packed. People are beyond, you know, excited that the Ohio State football coach is there having breakfast, and Woody's taking photos and posing for, you know, and he's and you know, signing autographs. Couldn't be friendlier to all the fans that were there, you know, and he's buying people, you know, breakfast and everything else. And finally, after the morning crowd leaves and has to jump on their flights and they're about ready to get back in the car and drive back to Columbus, Earl says, you know, I just needed to know what that was about. So he goes, Coach was in a good mood, so I think I can ask him now. I said, Coach, I got to ask you something. And Woody said, what? He said, you know, last night, when you woke up in the middle of the night, and he's now whispering so no one else hears this. You know, he goes, when you woke up in the middle of the night and you started screaming, F them all. Who are you talking about? And he said, suddenly Woody got the intensity of game day on his face. And he pointed his finger right at Earl Bruce and he said, I met every one of those blankety blank boosters and hanger-ons and influencers who think I owe them a blanking thing. I don't owe them anything. I coach this team. I decide who plays. I owe them nothing, and I'll give them nothing except the best our team has every Saturday. That's all they get out of me. And if they don't like it, F them all.